Let me show you how it's done.
Welcome. You are listening to The Drop, podcast on business, tech, and influence. I am one half of The Drop, Tam Danier, head of strategy. I lead insights and product. I focus on tech, in particular, solutions that solve real-world problems. And I'm here with...
My name is B. Pagels Minor. My pronouns are they, them, theirs. I have been a product manager for over a decade at some of the world's most well-respected companies like Sprout Social, Apple, and Netflix. I've led teams that built important parts of the App Store, launched games at Netflix, built listening at Sprout Social. All in all, my DNA is fully being a product manager. Folks, I am so happy today. One of the few people who are on my hug list, Tam can tell you all about this later. I have a very short list of people who can give me a hug because I'm not a hugger. And Lexi Butler made the list on the very first day, which the only other person who did that was my wife. So Lexi is currently chief of staff for one of the distinguished engineers at Twitter. Previous to this role, Lexi held roles at Facebook and Airbnb. Lexi is also the founder of Sista Circle, Black Women in Tech, a community of 14,000 plus Black women and non-binary folks. Lexi has spent her career helping to manage, create policy, and generally execute across legal, finance, and compliance amongst some of the world's most well-known brands. Lexi has literally been in the room to help make some of the most difficult, complex decisions in modern tech company has had to face. Lexi, again, I'm so excited to have you here. To get us started, one of the things I think is really great and something I find to be very true, on your website you say, I'm a professional storyteller, thought leader, and self-proclaimed freedom fighter. I like to say that I'm militantly free, which is as free as anyone can possibly be. This just means that I'm able to say what I feel is right, not just for me, but also to those around me, without fear or the feeling of complacency overriding what needs to be said. That was a very powerful quote. And in fact, I wrote it down as like a little note. I was like, let me think about my own elevator speech of who I am. But I can actually imagine that being a person who operates without fear and with a focus on what is right helps a lot in your role as a chief of staff, helps a lot in your role as someone who's really trying to ensure large programs are rolled out well, they're compliant, they have legal frameworks. So can you elaborate a little bit more on your role and how it impacts the day-to-day decisions at a company like that?
Yes. So I think that it's funny when I think about that quote on my website, when I was working with someone to create that language, I remember telling her that I am militantly free, not necessarily because I don't fear anything, but I fear not being militantly free. So if I have to choose between which plate, I choose the plate of I'm going to say what needs to be said. And part of that, I think, is a mix of just my personality and who I am, how I came out in this world. And I think I've always been that way in many capacities. And the other part of it is the career and that I've been in and that I'm currently actively in, where I'm literally in rooms all the time. And it's at that time of what decision are we making? We are no longer in a space where we can just dance around. We can, talk around the subject. What are we doing and why? And I've been very fortunate where I was put in that position at a very young age. And so I had to learn very quickly how in which to have hard conversations in a way that leaders, most of them who do not look like me, will receive. And whether or not they take my advice, they are actively listening to next steps, and we can come together to come up with a solution that largely I'm also cool with, so I can do my job well.
There's something that you said there that I think is very interesting, and I think it's one of the most complex and difficult things for any business, no matter what stage or how long they've been around. It's this idea of the why. Like, why the heck are we doing this? Yeah. Could you elaborate a little bit on how you help people get to the why?
Yes, I think the why is the most important. And I think that in order to get to the why, we have to get to the root of the issue. Many times in organizations and startups, big organizations, I don't care how big or small you are, when you're having these cross-functional conversations, you have people in the room that are coming with their own agenda. And there's no one actually in the room who says, so what's the actual issue? Like, you can talk to me, if you're in marketing, you can talk to me all day about why you want a $2 million budget for this new rollout. Okay. But you haven't given me a why. You've told me, obviously, I need the money because, Lexi, I need to have more fireworks, or I want to hire this celebrity for this campaign. That's a why. Okay, cool. But like, why do we need this massive rollout campaign for this product? And so for me, what I always tell folks is that my job, whether or not it's listed on LinkedIn or in my job title, is I want to come into these rooms, all these cross-functional players, and really figure out what is the root of the issue. Okay, so you need $2 million because you want to make this very sexy marketing campaign that if you are a startup, you may never have spent that much money on marketing. And then I hear from finance, hypothetically, and they're like, we don't have the money. If we do this, we're going to have to take money out of this budget. But then I hear from the product people and they say, yeah, but Lexi, when this thing rolls out, this is going to change us from startup mode to possible IPO. Okay, so the root of this is because there are people in the room who think that this next thing that we're launching is going to take us in a step in our business that if we don't launch huge and sexy and lights and cameras and action, then less people will know about it. And then therefore we can't make it to some kind of goal in 10 years. That's a good reason to get $2 million. And so I'm always pushing people, stop looking at your actual agenda and start looking at to the business core of why you have this supposed issue, if it's an actual issue. And then let's focus on solutioning that issue. Another good example, I would say, I think right now privacy is the currency of the internet. And a lot of companies are thinking about privacy. It is very publicly known. We have a lot of companies with FTC decreements and talking to the government, and the government's being upset about how can you let this happen? And these companies are required to change in how they work, how they build products, how in which they communicate to their user base of what they're actually doing with your information.
Yeah.
The root of the why is because the government said so. The root of the why is not because these companies were thinking about it. If the companies were thinking about that, they would have built products that had that functionality in that from day one. And so when I'm in rooms like that, the root of the why is we must do XYZ because these multiple government entities all around the world are saying that if we don't do that, there could be very huge consequences that are in a spectrum of costing us hundreds of thousands of dollars a day, all the way to your product cannot be in said country. If y'all are willing to take that risk, blessings. But it sounds like we need to figure out how we are going to respond to this government's thing. And that is the root of the why. I do think having people in the room that can really get to the heart of the why and all of these very complex conversations drives efficiency and costs you less money.
Yeah.
Lexi, it sounds like a lot of what you're talking about is design thinking and root cause analysis. We solve real problems, getting to the root, to the why. And the other part of it, I think what you're alluding to is in the companies that don't have that, they're forced to solve problems based on compliance. You're talking about FTC getting, or the government getting in and saying, you have to do this. Yeah. So the why is the compliance. Do you have an opinion on why you think companies just don't have this ingrained capacity? Is this not part of lean? Meaning being lean means we don't take into account these things that could be a problem. We only face what we must face. And to what extent is that a risk?
Yeah. So number one, it's a huge risk. These are very huge risks. You do need to think about this stuff all the time, and you should be actively looking for experts in this field to come into the room. I always joke with folks that there should be a chief Y officer at every company. And their job should be this like strategic person who walks into these cross-functional rooms and is like, why are you doing it? And until you give me an actual good reason why, the answer is no. There should be a chief Y officer, and we don't have them. I think going back to your first question, the reason why many companies don't have this is because a lot of these companies are built on these weird dreams. Weird dreams are, hey, wouldn't it be cool if people could talk in 140 characters to each other? Before Twitter existed, that was weird. That was weird. And I would argue that weird factor made Twitter what it is. Before Twitter existed, nobody was walking around saying, hey, I'm just going to put 140 characters online to tell people that I like the Grammys. That was
It was
weird.
an unspoken desire.
It's like, okay.
Yeah.
You know, and I definitely wasn't in the room when Twitter was created, but I can only imagine when Jack Dorsey was initially going to people and saying, hey, wouldn't it be cool if people could just tell people what they thought about the sports game in 140 words? And people were like, why would anybody care about your thoughts? And now look what it is, right? Look at Facebook. Facebook was really founded upon this like weird psychology experiment at a college where they were like, hey, wouldn't it be cool if everybody could like, connect with their classmate on the internet? And their classmate could be like, I like puppies and I'm from Louisiana. And then for whatever reason, people thought that was cool. That was weird at the time. And I think that because it's so ingrained in our hearts and our minds and our bodies now, it's just duh. But we have to remember when these companies were created, this stuff was weird. It was weird to be able to communicate to someone in 3 continents away with a simple click. And so because of that weirdness, I can only imagine that when these weird quote unquote ideas were thought of, nobody was sitting there saying, and what are the data implications of all this? And what about people's privacy?
So there's 2 things. One, chief Y officer, I feel like their number 1 tool should be like a little water spray bottle. And like you spray the cat. It's like you spray, it's like, no, that wasn't an answer to my why. Like that should be like the tool that they have. Yeah. So that's the first thing. That's exactly what I thought of when you said that. But to your point, part of it's not fun. Many of the companies I worked for, I went to law school. I'm a very proud law school dropout. But they would always put me on all these legal and compliance projects. And everyone would be like, oh my gosh, be like, look, we like totally appreciate you because you're the one who takes the stuff other people don't like. And I'm like, but that doesn't make sense, right? Because if this doesn't go well, we will not be a company anymore. We could be dismantled if we do this wrong, especially when you're talking about the ways in which, you can lose trust, right? For instance, Robinhood, I think, is a great example because they had the huge security issue. And I was like, wait, they don't even have basic best practices for protecting information. I can't work with a financial institution that doesn't have that, right? And so I'm sure that with what you said, like this weird idea is the thing I love most. And I don't want to have this other thing take the fun out of that. And so the chief Y officer is also not the chief fun officer. And you have to like dedupe that.
Yeah. Oh yeah. It's the adult that says you have to eat your green beans before you eat your vegetables, before you eat your dessert. I use that analogy all the time at work. It's become a joke. When I walk in the room, it's, oh, here comes the vegetable eater. And I think what you said, B, is very impactful. That's the reason. Nobody wants to eat their green beans before they eat their ice cream. And for people who do, yeah, you're weird. So I understand why people don't want to have these conversations. I think my concern with it is that, but we are adults and this is how the world works. And at the end of the day, like using Robinhood, for example, we can eat our ice cream all we want to. And as soon as that article went public and people started reading it, and early adopted Robinhood users had read that, I don't have the data. I've never worked at Robinhood, but now you have lack of trust. So how does this company actually sustain itself? So now we're going back to the vegetables. And so always having that person in the room or that department in the room from the first step of, yes, let's have these cool posters and let's have these cool t-shirts and let's travel around the world and blue. And let's make sure everything is actually being developed according to the law and or having a wonderful legal team that is making strategic risk on how we interpret the law. So, for example, we can make sure that we have best practices for financial security to our users. Robinhood is just one example. Remember, all of these companies around the world, any company that can take money from you has to have financial best practices. Mm-hmm. Whether it's an actual company that is branded on finances, Robinhood, or whether it's a company that allows you to post cute pictures of your puppy, Instagram. They all have to have that because we're all dealing with money in some capacity. So why don't we have these people in the room from the day the company is started, especially now in 2022? I would argue that when Silicon Valley really blew up, especially from a social media perspective, these companies weren't thinking about, oh, at some point we're going to ask for money. I highly doubt Mark Zuckerberg was in Palo Alto in the early stages of Facebook. Yeah, and then at some point we're gonna have Facebook Marketplace.
Mm-hmm.
It's 2022. So any startup, any company being created, it is very clear anything that you can think about, you can possibly achieve. So why wouldn't you put those people in the room early? Why is it that startups usually put a lot of money towards people who can make the product and then use money to consult out legal and compliance? And then 2 to 3 years in, they like hire a legal team. It's wild to me.
You know what? I would like to change the narrative about it being an adult in the room. Asking why is a very kid-like thing. It's about bringing the kid in the room. Puts me firmly in this position. I question everything.
Yeah.
And so opposite of B, I'm not an early adopter. I spend a lot of time questioning things. There's a very investigative approach to how strategists think. But I think the value of having someone in the room asking these questions, why, is because this is real life. Doesn't matter if you don't acknowledge them in the room, real life will acknowledge it for you. I always say, especially these companies who rely too much on consultants, and the world will not bend to your PowerPoint. No. That's not how this works. So all of this culture where everything is yes man, let's just put it in a deck and then we're going to pour millions of dollars into executing something. The world does not give a damn about how much time you spent in a room patting each other on the back. There does need to be someone, a kid in the room, who's not ingrained in this kind of yes man culture to say, hey, this kind of looks fishy. I really don't understand this. Have you thought about this? Is this like this? What do you mean by that? Because a word is being floated around and everybody has a different understanding of what that word means. And it's just going on as part of the zeitgeist of the culture that, hey, we're not going to ask a question about what this means, but nobody understands what this means. That's why consultants will always be in business. We just come in from the outside and say, hey, been noticing, I've been hearing this a whole lot.
Yeah, and you know what, to add to that, Tam, and I appreciate it, maybe it's the kid in the room who says why, maybe it's the adult in the room who requires the execution of that why. Because I've also been in rooms where we've had people say, hey, that don't look right, and nobody listens. Right. For many reasons. It's not just the kid in the room that says why. We need the executioner in the room that has the power to say, okay, so before we launch blah, we gonna figure that out. Instead of allowing the whys and then nothing happens. Because I have been in situations where things have really blown up and we are in the room and people were in, you have the leader come in and say, how did this happen? And we're all sitting there and someone's like, so who's going to tell this person that we like low key thought about this 8 months ago? But then someone said, don't worry about it. But
do you believe that's about misaligned incentives? There's somebody in the room that really has a lot of power. Incentives.
This is about power.
Yes. I love that idea of having the person in the room. You've had these great leaders who are in the room who have this ability to, even though they might agree, they still ask the right types of questions. They still challenge in the right types of way to actually create the ability for the organization to move forward, to make better decisions. And I really believe in that. So if I'm a VC and I'm looking at a startup, I go, all these people have worked together for forever. They're really good friends. Their kids go to school. Who is the person in that room who's saying something like, oh, maybe we aren't. Are we sure that we've thought about everything? And so that's what I'm always looking for when I'm in spaces. I'm like, who's the person who's gonna disagree? And actually, Tam and I are like this together, because Tam is always like, B, I might agree with you, but I'm about to break down your argument in such a way that I'm going to destroy you and then build you back up together. And that's important. That's super, super important to have that person. Yeah. And then the second thing, this is something that I really learned at Apple, and I think it's super, super important. So the thing at Apple is if one country created a law, chances are the next country is going to create something similar or even worse than that law. And you'd be like, okay, so instead of me just sitting back and waiting, right? This is my strategy. It's like, it doesn't make sense for me to wait and go, let me do the bare minimum to address the issue for this country's customers. Instead, let me think about let me think 5 years out. If this is what the law is right now, it's going to get more difficult from a technology perspective. Hey, do I need to go ahead and overhaul my infrastructure? Do I need to go ahead and overhaul my policies? Because I'm going to try to get there beforehand so that I can always delight my customers. So why don't you go ahead and take care of it?
Especially in international waters, like I think in the United States, it's a little more convoluted, but especially in like the EU and stuff. A good example, what you were talking about, GDPR. I'll never forget the day, and I was at Airbnb. It was like September, October of 2017, where I was put in a room. And at this time, Airbnb was quite small. And so we had these weekly all legal meetings. So the GC would come, we'd sit in a room and talk about stuff. And he was like, y'all hear about this GDPR Irish thing? It's a thing. And we're going to have to comply. Somebody needs to, Lexi, can you get some people together and we can just start like sifting through the documentation? I remember by January 2018 being at Airbnb, and it was like, no, this is really happening, and this is due on May 25th or else. Like May 25th was D-Day in the Silicon Valley for everyone. And everybody, I feel like every company and anybody working on GDPR had like a sigh like, oof, we still have our product in these countries. And at that moment, I was working for Facebook and I was in London for work. I remember May 25th hit, and it was like May 26th, 27th, and we were in the office, and I was talking to a coworker, and I said, so now what? Like, we finished. And he happened to be a lawyer, and he looked at me, and he laughed, and he said, oh, we're going to do this again. And I said, really? And I was like, no, that sucks. And he's like, oh, yeah, the rest of the world was just watching to see if Ireland can pull it off. It is now 2022. The list of regulatory laws and name the, like, just insert the country is insane. And the fact that when you actually read the laws, all it is GDPR plus or minus like some sprinkles. A good example, LGPD, Brazil. That was probably the biggest one that's come out recently. And that was what, 2020, 2021. And I remember like working on LGPD at Twitter, and every tech company, their legal analysis was like, okay, so can somebody get that document from GDPR? Can somebody just bring that out? Okay, everybody, can y'all just read that? Okay, cool. So just read that. And then we're going to read that. And then we're going to compare it to this document that the Brazilian president sent. And then we just going to fill in the blank. We're not rebuilding stuff. And I would argue that every LGPD response in Brazil in 2021 was literally GDPR plus a little bit, plus a minus, whatever their legal risks they wanted to take. We have another one coming. India's coming up, and that's going to be huge considering the billions of people in India who use a lot of these products. If you don't comply, it's going to be a problem. And so I do think that companies are getting better, but again, when you are at like a Facebook, when you're at a tech titan, when you're at a Facebook, when you're at an Apple, when you're at an eBay and Amazon, and I use the word titan not just for the brand name of it all, but just like the sheer number of employees that you have, like the sheer number of like countries that you're in, you have to respond, and it's harder to respond because you have to take steps back. If you are the startup who's just starting right now, who just got their first seed of funding, learn from those tech titans, build this stuff in as you go. So you don't have to backtrack. I have been in rooms at some of these companies where it's like, it would have been so much easier if we had just done this 15 years ago. And the amount of work that we have to do to go back in order to move forward, just learn the lessons now. Just build it.
Could you define what a GC is?
Yes. So a GC is general counsel. The general counsel is the head of legal. So at any of these companies, tech or non-tech, any corporate companies, there is a legal department. They hire in-house lawyers to work on the stuff they work on. And the head of that department, we call him, her, they, the GC. Some organizations call it like the head of legal. Titles are on a spectrum, but usually at these major tech companies, when you hear the term, oh, the GC is coming to this meeting, it is the person who runs the whole legal organization. It is also the person that when the CEO says, what are we doing? They have to respond. Yeah.
Anybody who was a product manager of a public-facing site or product in 2018 had to deal with GDPR, which for the listeners is General Data Protection Requirements, a nasty little nuisance that we all had to deal with. So I think I want to go back to on this path about GCs and these compliance things. So I want to go back to this idea of why this role is not appreciated in the room, and the narrative around that, like the person who asks why is a troublemaker, the team player.
Yeah.
And when you're on a quest to build something, these are the people that usually get pushed aside or quieted down. And the greatest historic reference to that of how this has gone bad is the Challenger. I don't know if anybody realizes the Challenger, the Space Challenger, that crashed because they would not listen to any naysayers in the room. They had identified this problem, but hey, you don't believe in greatness. I'm just summing this up for dramatization, is basically what happened, and you get kicked out of the room. So the question to you is, at this point, what is the risk of not taking the naysayers or not having this kind of competency? Anecdotally, any stories you can share of this is what's at play or this is what's going to happen?
Really bad things, from your users getting physically hurt. It depends on what kind of product you're building, but people getting physically hurt, all the way to your company not surviving. I think a really good example that I can talk about publicly was I joined Airbnb March 2016. And I joined as a compliance project manager. Before that, I was a technical program manager at a company called NetApp. So I joined Airbnb. I was just like, I just want to do something different. I want to work at the hot startup. I was really tired of going to Christmas dinner and then having that uncle say, so where do you work and what do they do? I wanted to work at like the cool named company. Even if I could have been the janitor, I could have been the CEO. I wanted a brand that I was like, this is what it is. And people would be like, oh. So I took this job as a compliance project manager, not really knowing what compliance is. And really March 2016 was how my career into this space started and really transformed. And I haven't really looked back since. Airbnb was very small. I think I was employee like probably in the early 2000s. Hot startup. Everybody was loving Airbnb. It was everywhere. Everybody was talking about it. This concept of microeconomies and how you could rent out your guest house to someone and you get a coin and then it's cheaper than it was big. 2.5 weeks after I joined Airbnb, I will never forget the head of policy, the GC, the head of legal, the head of finance, and the CEO. They went to the head of compliance, who was my director, so my boss's manager. And I just happened to be in the room because, again, we're still a startup, so we don't really have concepts of this should be like a private conversation. I was just in the room. And I remember the CEO saying, we have an issue because we have people on Twitter who made up a hashtag called Airbnb while black. And what they're doing is they're saying that they are being discriminated against either before they get to their Airbnb. So they try to book an Airbnb and then the person realizes they're black and then they get denied. Or we had cases when they got there, they booked successfully, they got on their plane, they're so excited for their trip, and they get to the door at 7 p.m. at night and the person opens the door and is like, oh, sorry, no. Before this, Airbnb had a policy. We had a policy that for whatever reason, if you couldn't get into your Airbnb or something happened, we put you up in a hotel because safety first, and that's important. But then with this started coming up and people started talking and saying, yeah, Airbnb got me a hotel room, so I wasn't stranded, but this is not okay. And I'll never forget the CEO being like, what are we going to do about this? Because understand that when these people created Airbnb, they never thought of this concept that,
Of course.
oh, like somebody who looks different, or what if it is a couple that is not cisgender or heterosexual, or however you define what a couple should look like? What if the person is wearing clothing like a hijab that you don't like, and then you just turn them? And I'll never forget that what people didn't know was publicly we shared these findings and we made this beautiful PR thing about how like we're working on this. And I actually got to be the program manager who ran our discrimination task force. And that was like this big point of my life. What they didn't know was privately, one of the reasons why this was so important to us is that as this is coming to public light, we're secretly building this thing called Airbnb experiences, where people aren't staying at your place, where let's say that Tam, you own a pottery studio and you can have an experience of come do pottery. Let's say that you are in Japan, and I don't know if this is still an experience, but I remember when it first rolled out, it was in my head, like, if I ever went to Japan, I would do this experience. And it was this person who did this whole samurai experience, and you got to make a samurai sword. And so as the world knows that we are publicly trying to figure this out, and what does Airbnb respond to someone closing the door in B's face for walking into their Airbnb and B being a Black non-binary human, we're also privately B being denied at 7 p.m. at an Airbnb because they are a Black non-binary identified human, and us getting them a hotel room is honestly not our biggest issue if y'all want to roll this out. Because what happens if there's an Airbnb surf experience and then we all get to the beach and somebody takes off their shirt because we're surfing and there's a swastika tattoo on their back? How does this work? And so a lot of the work that I did at Airbnb, it actually wasn't about the issue that the users brought up. It was about us thinking forward about all the other stuff that we were bringing out and how we respond to that to benefit that.
You're saying a lot in that story. On one hand, you're talking about a company and startup very still early on in their infancy, who took the initiative to bring in this competency and see forward thinking. This is the vision of this company, and we can see that if this stands, the viability of this company is at risk. Something similar, writers were getting discriminated against, and they came out and we have to solve for this. And I think that you can look at some companies, and of course, these are white cisgendered guys who can't think outside of themselves. And you can look at the lack or the gap in that design of their system and say, all right, they're bad, but they can fix it. You can see that they can fix it because they have a vision of the company. What do you say, knowing what you know now, when you see a company like the fintech companies who do not have this capacity for compliance or for designing for future risks, and they still launch anyway? Does that put to you on the borderline of, hey, they're learning, they're startups, or is that to you say this is a bit of a scammy kind of thing when you know what you don't know and you're going to do it anyway? At what point are you Theranos versus Airbnb?
Yeah. I think in this day and age, if you know that you don't know and you still launch, we have a problem. Period. Because we're talking about not only, so for the Airbnb example, I used it because I was like, that's a clear example of somebody's life.
Yeah.
People walking into an Airbnb and being discriminated against because of what they look like or what's on their hair or whose hand they're holding to get into their place. Best case scenario, they have a wonderful experience. Middle case scenario, we put them up in a hotel. Worst case, this could be somebody's life.
It's life, right?
And I remember I was in the room, and as this dark-skinned, Black 20-something who's from St. Louis, Missouri, I remember hearing, like, reading the tweets and telling people in the room, I was like, oh, no, this is not just about, oh, they closed the door in my face. Where I come from, you could die.
Yeah.
This is much bigger than just like, we're going to lose some money or we have to take money out of the insurance fund to pay for B's Marriott hotel bill for a week. Like, somebody could die. And I think that the reason why Airbnb was so good at responding to that, and not only responding to the issue at hand, but building out practices for future products, was because we were very clear on the fact that this could be somebody's life. This is not a game. And do you want that PR New York Times article? Because that could actually end your company. So we've ended lives and we've ended companies. And so I think that at this day and age, when you have companies, especially in fintech, who are deciding to make these steps, knowing that we have some clear issues and we at least don't have a 6-month plan on how to solve them. I always tell people tech is very interesting because a lot of times, y'all, we're doing stuff and we're just gonna make this work, but we're gonna wing it. But
there's winging it, and then there's design by design. You did not
boom. I have definitely been in situations where it's like, this product is going to launch tomorrow. Here are the 5 things that we need to fix. And by the way, we will fix them in the next 5 months. And we have the dedicated resource to do it. Go be great, team. Anybody ask you anything, you don't know. Especially in fintech, people's money, especially with all this crypto stuff coming out and Web3 and what does that look like, where cryptocurrency by design is like the money's not in your hand. So people are already a little skeptical about crypto, which I personally think, which makes it a very intriguing conversation. You as a fintech company producing things, doing things, launching things, actively knowing you don't have all your ducks in a row, and also actively knowing you don't have a plan to get them in a row in the next 90 days is a huge problem and a very big risk, and a huge risk to me as somebody who would work at that company. I would argue that I probably may not work at that company because I'm like, are we going to be around in a year?
So obviously, we acknowledge that not every startup has the capacity to hire an internal general counsel or legal expert or compliance expert when they first start.
Yes.
But there is a risk to not investing in at least the thought frameworks or thought in the thinking of these risk things. Because one of the things that really came to mind for me for that, first of all, so obviously I was one of those people. In fact, my wife is white, so we actually changed our profile picture to just be her image so that we could always guarantee that we could get Airbnb. FYI, like we tried to game the system for our safety, which is very interesting. But the second part of that is that as a startup, if you think about Airbnb, like economically trying to then recoup the trust of this cohort of users, like you're having to put them up in a hotel and you're not getting the money from the rental that they had. You put them up in a hotel and you might have to kick off that person who's renting off their property. So if you start looking at that, losing money. And if that starts happening at very large amounts, you don't survive as a startup. And so part of what we're saying here is that this thinking through these things, right? Thinking through the why, thinking through the risk, thinking through the compliance is also a way to make sure that you're economically viable, right? Because you don't have to worry about that thing hitting you and then you lose everything. You lose your ability to actually continue to see if you have product market fit, for instance. So having said that, we're getting close to the end of the podcast. Lexi, first of all, I know you got a crap ton of stuff always going on. So what's the things that we most need to know about Lexi and what's going on with you right now?
Yeah. I am the very proud and humbled founder of Sista Circle Black Women in Tech, which is a 14,000 plus Black women organization, solidarity group for Black women in the tech industry that was actually started when I was at Airbnb, because I realized very quickly the rooms that I was in, I need to learn how to talk to people and ask why, and also be the executioner for that why. Talk to a lot of leaders who do not look like me. And how do I do that as this dark-skinned, braided and or curly haired Black woman who's usually the shortest person in the room? How do I do that? How do I gain authority and seek authority and expect authority from leaders in these compliancy conversations without getting the angry Black woman thing? And to be very frank, it still happens all the time. And at this point in my career, I'm okay with that because those feelings are not mine. But as a late 20 something, it was like, how do I navigate that? So I started this organization, and now we have over 14,000 plus people around the world, part of tech companies. And we recently launched our professional opportunities newsletter for jobs and speaking engagements, because it was really our idea of how do we combat these media announcements of all these layoffs and rescinding offers and hiring freezes. The best way is for our own community to have a very easy access way to, but these people are hiring, but this person's looking for a speaker. And I keep telling folks, the recession is coming. Some would argue that it's already here. I cannot focus on that. I can focus on the but and. This person got a layoff. Yeah, but and this person is hiring, but this person's looking for someone, but this person needs this. And so how do we get that access to our community? And then also, I am a speaker and a thought leader, and I do a lot of that on the contents of privilege and equity, because I do think that the rooms that I've been in, the rooms that I am in all the time, I'm very much an equitable leader. I want people to be safe, seen, valued, and paid fairly. If I can make sure you are safe, seen, valued, and paid fairly, you are going to do phenomenal work. And especially right now in a recession, I need people who do phenomenal work. So I do a lot of conversations and storytelling and workshops on what it actually looks like not to be an ally, but to be a freedom fighter for your direct reports, to really build these very intimate relationships with them, so you know what their privileges are and what their lack of privilege is, and how you align your privilege to their lack of privilege in order for them to just do their job in a safe environment.
And so, question for you is, where do you want to be?
Yes, you can find me on Twitter and on Twitter and Instagram at Lexi B Speaks, and you can find me on LinkedIn at literally Lexi, Lexi, and then B. But yeah, hit me up. I'd love to continue these conversations. And I want to thank you both for doing what you're doing. I think this podcast and these conversations, these narratives are very important as people continue to build dope products and, as we called it, weird things that at some point will not be weird and will just be part of the ecosystem, but just making sure they're really thinking about this stuff so they can just make more money faster.
Thank you so much for listening to the Drops Podcast. We love having you. We love your feedback. Please do connect with us across social media. We are the Drops Podcast on Facebook, Twitter, and TikTok. And we also have a great email, thedropspodcast@gmail.com. You can send in any questions that you have, and we definitely would love to answer them on the podcast. Feel free to ask just about anything because we have experienced a ton of different things. Again, thank you so much for listening to the Drops Podcast.